Welcome to the Women's Connection. I'm Barrie Switzen, your moderator. The Women's Connection is a program about events shaping women's lives and helping one gain authentic power on a personal or professional level. So won't you stay tuned?
Welcome. Today we're going to talk about one of the most annoying subjects around, and what I mean is noise, acoustics. No matter where you go, unless you're out in nature, the sounds can just be so annoying to one another. And with me is a former guest, and I'm delighted to have her come back, Arline Bronzaft and Barrie Schnitta. And we're going to, like I said, talk about sound. So welcome back, Arline.
Pleasure to be back.
And Barrie, welcome.
Thank you.
Now, Arline, why don't you just give us a brief summary of your history?
Well, I got involved in noise because a parent in one of my classes said that her child was attending a classroom adjacent to an elevated train track. And the sound from the trains was coming in every few minutes. And the children were complaining about being disturbed by the sound. And would I do something to help? Well, that led to a study to determine whether indeed the train sound coming in every 4 minutes was disturbing their learning. It also intruded on the teacher's teaching. And by the 6th grade, the children exposed to the train track sounds compared to the children on the quiet side were nearly a year behind in reading. And that's serious. And that demonstrated that both teaching and learning were intruded upon by the noise of the trains. But I couldn't stop there because the mother had asked me to help the children. So what I did was I asked the transit authority to test out a procedure to quiet the track, which they were looking into, and asked them to do it adjacent to the school, and asked the Board of Ed to put acoustical ceilings in the classrooms. This was the 70s. I considered the response to these requests as miracles. But indeed, after the abatement, the classrooms were quieter. A public official asked me to go back and see if the children's reading had improved. And I reported that at a later study, when I compared the children on the quieter side with the children now near the track but less noisy, they were both reading at the same level. Well, with results like that, and they're considered the 2 landmark studies in the field, my life changed. And from that day on, most of my research focused on sound, and not just doing the studies, as I've done on the effects of noise on people living near airports, but trying to do something to alleviate the sound. And having had 5 mayors appoint me to Grow NYC, a volunteer, non-paid position, I'm able to really work with people in the city of New York and try to alleviate some of their noise problems.
It's fantastic, and we're going to talk about even in the apartments what you can do. Barrie, how did you create your company?
Well, I started out as a mathematician, so my first course in advanced math showed the Tacoma Bridge, which is when the wind blew, it started to sway and collapse. And I remember at that point going, whatever that field is, that's what I'm going to be. To make a long story short, I ended up getting a master's degree in mechanical engineering where I focused on vibration, realized that that was my passion, ended up with a PhD doing my work in what's called signal processing. So my training is that I can mathematically model signals and noise. So I started out doing underwater acoustics, radar, sonar. And then when my children were born, I decided to set up my own company. And I was doing just consulting, and then people would come and say, well, this just isn't working. And I'd say, it's not an art, it's a science. So I went out in the field and I tried to see, one, what the failure was, and saw that it was sometimes improperly purchased materials or improperly installed, and getting to know people better, their sensitivities, and what it was that really bothered them, and what their own personal definition of quietude was. So I then set up I did a reset on my company in 2000, called it Sound Sense, and I have the consulting division, material division, and installers with several patents.
Something new in the marketplace when it comes to sound. And I saw it all over Europe, and I didn't really think too much about it because I would see what we call wind farms and these turbines. Never thought about it, but you and I were having lunch, and you said something that is the new noise, you could say, and that is going to be on our East River here. Why don't you share us a little bit more?
Well, it's interesting that wind turbines are now being thought of as a source of energy, an alternative source of energy, and it should be explored. Wind turbine sound was not new to me because I had my first windmill case about 30 years ago. And I remember when I got a call from this woman in Brigantine, New Jersey, that a windmill was being placed in the backyard of her neighbor. And she said, I'm just listening to it, and he's installed it, and I can't even walk around my apartment, my house. It was a house. Would you come out and listen to it? So I can say that I had a windmill case 30 years ago, and I experienced what that sound was. But that was just a windmill in the backyard. By the way, that windmill was closed down, and it did indeed disrupt the living activities of the people in that community. So now, fast forward all these years later, the question is, when we put up these wind turbines, and they are being put up in neighborhoods, and they're being put up close to people's homes, will we make sure that the impacts from the sound will not be disturbing to the people? And the research is still in its infancy stage. But the one thing that's happened is that people around the world have complained and said that the sound does disturb them. Not just the sound that we traditionally listen to on the A scale, but the low frequency sound as well. And what I find is that these people have been dismissed. I guess the children in my first study were dismissed too when they said they weren't doing well in classes because of the noise. I don't dismiss people. I say we have to listen to them. Maybe it's because I'm a psychologist, and Sigmund Freud developed his theories by just listening to people and finding out what bothered them. So what we're looking at are the studies that are being conducted now, looking at the research, making sure that where these windmills, I still use that 30-year term, wind turbine is being placed does not disturb people. And I've been asked to review studies. I've actually served on a committee in Canada to do a review of the literature. So I am watching that very carefully.
Now, what are some of the symptoms people express when they're exposed to these wind turbines?
Migraine headaches. They find that their sleep is disturbed. They feel uncomfortable. And not too different from what the woman reported to me 30 years ago, which led to a legal decision in New Jersey, that children are also living there. They're being disturbed by it. And so what you start with is, what are the people saying? Just as the people that live near airports, we now know from studies that were done that older people living near airports, there's an increase in cardiovascular disease, and means more admissions to hospitals for that disease for people living near airports. So what I think we tend to do in this country is we act first, and then we say, well, let's see if there'll be a problem. It would have been wiser to study first so that when you act, you can alleviate the problem. Be greater responsibility, both on the part of the wind turbine manufacturers and the government. The plus that I will say in favor of the wind turbine manufacturers is that there is a movement now to build quieter wind turbines. I think that movement grew out of the concern of people living near there. And so I think that's really testament to these people persisting and saying there's a problem here. And I don't know if they would have constructed quieter wind turbines if the people hadn't protested. That's a good sign. So I am hopeful that research will allow us to use this alternative energy. And I'm not even going into cost and economics and all of that. That's a separate issue. I'm going to just deal with the sound. If indeed this is an alternative that's viable, make sure you do no harm. And that's really the principle by which we should function in this country. When we introduce something new, whether it be a drug, whether it be a food product, whether it be an alternative source of energy, make sure that the introduction will not harm people who are being exposed.
Right, and put standards behind it. Like, as an example,
Yes.
the ANSI standards now in the schools have a mandate for what's called the reverberation time, which has to do, and the intruding noise levels. So it's based off of all of that, and it has firmed these standards within the schools. So for architects, it's a mandate.
Yeah, you're so right, because now legislation is being written, not just in our country. I know Vermont is going to have a hearing on legislation pertaining to wind turbines, I think within the next few days, very shortly. I know that there are hearings in Ontario, Canada, so that we have to recognize that standards will probably emanate from the research and the studies. But you don't get the standards until you do the research. And you mentioned the schools. You know, I'm very proud of the fact that I did these two studies. But,
Right.
you know, that study that I did was nearly 40 years ago.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
it did give rise to standards. And now people accept the fact that children in schools should have quieter environments, though that's not the practice. And I
Right.
can say that universally.
Right, and you had pointed out a very important piece to it, and that is cost. So once the standard is in place, then whoever it is that is not meeting that standard, who before might have won, say, the wind turbine or the school contract, will no longer win it based on cost, because they have to put in the acoustic piece. Sometimes it's not more expensive, sometimes it is, but the person who wins it will be competitive based on those standards for sound and noise, which is great.
Let me speak to cost one more time, though. When we talk about cost in terms of acoustical treatment, we never discuss the cost to health of the people living near those airports. With all due respect to the air industry, and I do fly and I do support planes, if you can make things quieter, and that's a cost, think of how much more it would cost if you have to treat the illnesses of people living near airports. And remember I told you in my one study, the children were nearly a year behind in reading? Mm-hmm. What is the cost, educational cost? So everybody worries about the cost to the manufacturers, the cost to the landlords that are putting up the buildings. I'm concerned about the health costs and the educational costs to those who are inflicted with the sound. And in this country, I think health costs and educational costs are very large indeed. And it's one of the costliest things we have, is taking care of our children's education and our people's health.
Right. Well, I think it cycles back to the standards. So I'm a voting member of ASTM, American Standards of Testing and Measurement. And because the standards have come into play not only for classrooms and also for hospitals in terms of the acoustics, it means that all of us that are voting on what are those standards and what are the follow-up to the standards are now incorporating the different manufacturers. So they are become actively involved, and they have a lot of acoustical engineers that are participant, both in the Acoustic Society of America, noise engineers, and part of ASTM.
Bonnie, you had mentioned something about noise and parents should be aware of for children who have got attention deficit disorder, all kinds of illnesses. Mm-hmm. Why don't you address that? Because it seems like it's all part and parcel here.
It is, it is. I'm going to go off a little bit and come back. So we were talking about the low frequency, and one of the things that has surfaced because I work so closely with many of my clients is that a lot of people who have a thyroid problem have a very high sensitivity to low frequency noise. So sometimes they will hear a noise and it's very disturbing to them, and it's solely because of their thyroid problem. And so a lot of people will poo-poo it, that this is not a problem, I can't hear it, but the meters will pick it up. And that becomes important. And I'm actually working with some physicians on trying to look at that low frequency sensitivity, and is it just thyroid or is it also cancer, et cetera. But that segues into looking at children. So again, we do the installations, and I did this one installation in a school. We did the gymnasium. I looked in the classrooms, and I noticed that they were very reverberant, and we did, I personally requested that we treat the ceiling. And of course, there wasn't any money in the budget at the time, and I said, please, I'll just do one small room. And it was a private school. I'm not going to give out the name, but there were 2 identical classes, and there were a lot of children after halfway through the year that had originally been diagnosed with ADHD that no longer seem to be having a lot of those problems. And I could go off on that for a long time, but I won't, because I'll jump to another piece, and that is also people with a very high IQ are very noise sensitive. So if you go and you follow the standards now, the ANSI standards for schools, and you prevent the noise from coming in, so it could be HVAC, it could be traffic noise, it could be any kind of mechanical noise or clicking noise, something that's disturbing. Some people are disturbed by just hearing footfall going by, and then, or any kind of a buzz from the lighting. If you stop that intrusive noise, and then you reduce the reverberation time or the echo, which is also very important for hearing impaired, that you help the children to learn better. You help children that were suffering from what's called auditory fatigue, and then classified as ADHD that are no longer so. So it's this beautiful conclusion to a very simple thing.
I'm aghast with how I know how it affects me. I mean, I walk down the street or I'm on the bus or subway, and people don't realize how loud they are on their cell phones. And I'll say, thanks for sharing. And I get 2 different kinds of reactions.
That's right.
Like, you've got your nerve, or they become very quiet and realize what I have said.
You know, it's interesting. I don't know when you had the situation with the school, but when I hear things like this today, and there's another school in Queens that has a problem, I say to myself, I did this study 40 years ago. There were 30 studies that replicated what I had done and found that noise impacted adversely on children, ordinary children, children, of course, with deficits. I mean, that research was all out there. And I have a daughter who was 8 at the time when I did my research. And she says, you know, Mom, it seems that you haven't had much of an impact because the problem is still so strong. But one of the things we've neglected to talk about is the role of the government. And the fact that our government passed a Noise Control Act. We have a Noise Control Act, which is supposed to give all American citizens the right to some peace and quiet. And that act is still on the books. And we used to have an excellent Office of Noise Abatement and Control in the Environmental Protection Agency. We had all of that in the early 70s. And here we have a country with a law on the books, and there's no desire to actually abide by that law. And that I find particularly offensive.
You're the victim, but then it becomes you're the perpetrator.
Right. Well, the first step is, does the building meet building code? Because there are requirements in the building code for both STC, so that's sound transmission class, how much sound does a partition stop? That's floor to floor as well as apartment to apartment or room to room. And then IIC, you know, F in front of it means field. So IIC or FIIC, and that's footfall, impact insulation class. That's building code. So step number 1 is, does it meet building code? And typically it's not that expensive to have that determined. And then after that, through an acoustical engineer, there's typically good, better, best situations in terms of a solution set. Sometimes something it's as simple as putting down a simple, if someone is willing to put down a carpet, to put down a barrier and a pad, a special type of acoustic pad to absorb footfall, and then a carpet on top of it. And then oftentimes it'll eliminate footfall as well as reduce the sound going through.
Let me address that. As the person on noise for Grow NYC, In the city of New York, if you have a noise problem, you call the Department of Environmental Protection. You can call the police department. You can ask a legislator. Or you do what many of the people do in New York City. They call the mayor's office. And I do get those calls. And they deal with residences predominantly. And the person says, the next door neighbor, I can hear the person talking on the phone. What can I do about it? So I asked, have you complained to the landlord? Have you talked to the managing agent? Yes, but nothing is being done. And this is a very common problem. And it's not one that's part of the noise code. So people have to know there is a noise code in New York City, and it does cover certain areas, but not neighbor to neighbor. But there is a law that does cover neighbor to neighbor, and that's called the warranty of habitability section of one's lease. And as the mother of 2 daughters who were attorneys, a son-in-law who's an attorney, and my husband had been an attorney, I still believe everybody should look at the law and study the law. And I think the law has to be enforced. It's getting that enforced. How does that person get the landlord to ask the person above to put down that pad, to put down the carpeting? And these are the cases that I handle daily. And it doesn't seem to be so difficult, because if you just put down adequate padding and carpeting, you might solve that problem. But unlike Blanche Dubois in A Streetcar Named Desire, who depended on the kindness of others, I would like to say I, too, depend on the kindness of others. But with all these attorneys in my family, I depend on the law. And what I try to do in helping people with these problems is to approach the managing agent, to approach the landlord, and say, let's talk about what this person is entitled to. Am I always successful? No, not always. Have I a pretty good record? Yes, because after the program, I could share this latest email with you of how an acoustical engineer is coming in to solve the problem of the neighbor who's been complaining about the sound coming from next door. So what I'd like to urge people who are listening, they do have rights. Yes, I do believe people should be courteous and polite, but again, I'm going to rely on law. And I do think they can approach the managing agent, they can approach the landlord, you can ask your public official, your council person to help. And I know I shouldn't be saying this, but if anyone has such a problem in listening to the program, if you contact Row NYC, I will personally respond to your complaint.
Wonderful.
I've had many situations like that, and it's always sad when, and I'm working on one now, where I documented the noise. In my document itself, I mention the habitability, and the neighbor and the managing agent just are non-responsive.
You want to know what to do next?
No.
No,
We're there.
You're
We're
there.
But
You're
it's-
there. You can do
But
it.
it just makes me so sad.
Me too. Me
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
People should also know there is a noise code in New York City. So everyone listening to this program should go to the New York City Department of Environmental Protection website and look at the noise code. So if there's a bar in the community that is playing their music with the door open, that is covered in the noise code. The one problem is we don't have enough agents to go out and measure all the noise complaints that come through. But DEP, I think, works very hard in trying to resolve some of these issues. And I would urge people to go to that site, read it, and know what their rights are under the New York City Noise Code for certain disturbances in their neighborhood.
What's the sound level that you could say, okay, this is okay, you can live with, or should you be able to not hear them at all?
The warranty of habitability uses the word reasonable. Would a reasonable person be disturbed by it? And I'm going to tell you what I do when someone calls me. If a person were to call me and say a grandchild visits every 3 months and one toy is dropped, and that person is now complaining about that toy, I'd say, you know, lady, I don't think so. You're not being reasonable. So reasonableness is the issue. It isn't really a matter of decibels. For example, if you were trying to fall asleep and there was a leaky faucet next to your bed, that may not be a loud sound, but it's going to disturb your sleep. So what I try to do is talk to the person and find out, is this sound happening in the evening? Is it continuous? Are there ways that you think that these people could behave differently that may alleviate the sound? I do not go into decibel levels because I don't think it's a matter of decibel levels. The acoustician could correct the problem. That's, that's what I count on, the acoustical engineer. But I'm often dealing with problems where if someone were courteous, if someone were polite, for example, if you're getting up at 6 a.m. in the morning, do you have to put on your high heels and walk across the floor? I used to leave my house at 6:10. The shoes were at the door, and I put them on when I left. I did not even walk in the kitchen with the high heels. So I think if the people here listening want to contact Grow NYC, we would send them a brochure that would talk to ways that you could do things to alleviate the noise in your life. And remember, you also can be a noise maker, so be conscious of other people as well.
Right. And there, you brought something up about decibels, and I think there's a little piece to this that sometimes people try to solve it themselves. They're trying to stay on budget. And this is sometimes when they get into trouble. So now I am going to talk about decibels. A decibel is not a linear function, it's logarithmic, just like earthquakes. So 1, 2, or 3 is considered barely perceivable, just like you hardly ever hear about a 1 or a 2 earthquake. 4 and 5 is considered significant and perceivable, so it's a logarithmic function. Now, what's so interesting is that doubling of the sound is roughly adding 10 dB. So that sounds like, oh, this is a lot. But if you think about, if someone is trying to sell you a solution and then they say, oh, I can solve 90% of your problem, and you just go, wow, that's fantastic. But if your noise is 20 dB, whatever the noise is, mechanical or whatever, is 20 dB above background, and you take care of 10 dB, you're still 10 dB above background. So it's just something I thought I would mention, because sometimes people are very frustrated because they fell for that 90% or 67%, which is, so many dB above background. It is a lot of energy, but if it's not energy sufficient to bring it down to only a few dB above background, then it's not going to solve the problem, and then they've just thrown their money out the window. So I think that's a very important piece to solving it in a way that's going to make people happy. A little bit further on the subject matter of the building code. So basically, building code puts the number 50 for STC and 50 for IIC. IIC is footfall, STC is sound. That's through floor to ceiling, and that's wall to wall. What does that mean? So a 50 STC means that you cannot hear elevated speech, period. That's what it means. Now, what does it mean in terms of construction? If you have a standard wall where it's drywall, a stud, insulation between the stud, drywall, that is not going to be a 50. So someone has to do more than that, or they are not meeting building code. There's another problem. Another problem is, and this was documented by the Canadian lab, and independently and almost at the same time, I was working on this problem and ended up patenting a device to test for it. And that is, if you have a 1-inch hole, which could be back-to-back outlets, or it could be the seam where the drywall meets the baseboard, and it's not properly caulked or it doesn't meet completely, that will degrade the STC of the wall by 10 points. So even though it has an STC of 50, when it is installed, the FSTC, which by code they will give you an allowance of about 5 points or so, but it'll take it down to like a 40 or less, which means you're going to clearly hear everything that's being done. So many times we will go in, we will look at the configuration, because based on lab tests, we know whether or not it's going to work. So sometimes people will say, well, is this wall going to work? And we can say, please show me the drawing. So we work with architects and we make certain that those walls have an STC of 50. And then afterwards, we do testing, field testing, to make sure that there's no holes or no back-to-back outlets, that all the seams are properly caulked. And when we do the documentation of the walls itself in terms of the architectural drawing, we do specify that. So I think anyone who's having any type of a problem where they clearly hear their neighbor next door, then more than likely they are not meeting building code, especially if they just did a renovation.
In the closing moments of the show, what would you ladies like to leave the audience with?
First of all, I'd like to leave the audience with the idea that they should say something. I mean, I know I'm intruding upon the transit authorities' slogan, see something, say something. I think if you are indeed bothered by noise, if you're disturbed by it, speak up. And be reasonable. I mean, don't shout at the person. But I think if you asked politely, not that everyone will respond as you would like them to, but at least try that. And the second thing is, do know the law. Do use the law. The laws are there to protect the people in the city of New York, and I would urge them to go to the DP website, know what the law is, and also read their lease and know that they have rights in their homes. And that they should also be conscious of other people and not disturb them.
A very long time ago, I wrote an article. It was called The Paradise Effect. And it is because what I have found over my many years of being an acoustic engineer, that there is a level of quietude that gives you comfort. I have treated some rooms and people walk in and they'll say, I don't know what you did and what's going on in this room, but it just makes me feel so good. Mm-hmm. So quietude, acoustics is a pressure wave, and it handshakes. We know for a fact that the right acoustic environment, which means no intrusive noises and just the right reverberation time, and everyone is different. Like I said, some people have a very high sensitivity to low frequency noise, hearing impaired, need a lower reverberation time. But what I do know is that this quietude, this personal quietude, is something that makes people feel better. It's a healthier environment. They learn better. They can communicate better. Example, noisy restaurant. How well can you talk in a noisy restaurant? Right. People heal better. Proper acoustics in a hospital. People heal faster and are out of the hospital, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we should all embrace it and make it part of our life.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, ladies, so much.
Thank you.
Thank
and
you.
I hope you have learned something, because I have learned a lot about sounds, acoustics, noise, and what to do about it. If you have any questions, please write us here at the Women's Connection. Bye now.